Hello, everyone. Welcome to the CEPR, EBRD, and Economics of Transition seminar series on the economics of industrial policy. My name is Cevat Aksoy. I'm a principal economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And today we have Jacqueline Platt with us from MIT Sloan School of Management. And Jacqueline will present her paper, Are Complementary Policies Substitutes Evidence from R&D Subsidies in the UK? Quickly, rules of the game. Jacqueline will have about 40 minutes, and then we will have the remaining 20 minutes for Q&A. If you have pressing questions and clarification questions during the presentation, please write it down in the chat box, and I will direct this question to Jacqueline. Other than that, we will collect all these questions at the end of Jacqueline's presentation. Jacqueline, floor is yours. You have 40 minutes.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And saying it's really nice to have some type of kind of continuity in our lives right now. So it's great to be able to give this talk, and thank you all for being here to everybody that's on the line. So I'm going to be presenting a paper that's taking a look at how two different subsidies for innovation or for R&D grants and tax credits interact in their effects on firm level R&D investments. So governments So fostering innovation and productivity has, of course, been of interest to kind of economists and policymakers for a very long time. And they spend, hundreds of billions of public dollars or public money on subsidizing innovation globally. So somewhere between 10 and 30% of business R&D expenditure is funded by the government. And there's good reason for this, right? So competitive markets are going to tend to undersupply innovative activity or investment in R&D due to knowledge spillovers. So the benefits of innovating are not fully appropriable by the firm. But we still know relatively little about what actually works. So what types of subsidies or what types of tax credits work and why. And so one of the kind of key complications is that governments tend to use multiple mechanisms or multiple interventions that tend to be layered on top of each other. And so, for instance, one of the most common forms of subsidy for firm level or private R&D or private innovation is to provide direct grants. So these would be things that are, like the government runs a competition or several competitions from a pool of money. And they can either be focused on specific technologies or areas, or they could be broad-based. But basically, they're running competitions for firms to bid into a pool of money, and then that firm will receive a direct grant to support their R&D or innovation project. And then on top of that, it's often the case that, especially at least in the developed world, many countries have tax credits for research and development as well. So in the UK, it's the case that for any project or R&D expenditure that's not funded by a direct grant, the firm can actually claim quite generous R&D tax credits as well. And these types of policies and subsidies are often framed as being kind of complementary policies or complementary subsidies for R&D or for innovation. But we don't actually know if that's true, right? So we don't know if they're complements or substitutes. It is the case that many firms do actually take advantage of both subsidy types, but knowing whether complements or subsidies really takes knowing, substitutes really takes knowing how they interact. And for instance, how the marginal effect of each one changes when a firm does receive both types of subsidies. So the question that this paper does address is, are direct grants and tax credits for R&D complements or substitutes? And just to give you a little bit of kind of economic intuition about what I mean here. So again, I'm going to be looking at how the marginal effect of, say, grants changes with a change in the tax credit rate. And the outcome there is just going to say, for the start, just going to be, say, R&D expenditures, the firm level R&D expenditures. And so you might imagine, so if you're, say, an innovative firm and you have many different R&D projects that are going on and you're investing in many different innovative activities, it might be the case that, say, okay, you have some new idea, it's going to cost you, say, £100,000. You bid into some type of grant pool, you win a grant that covers, say, 50% of that project. So say you're receiving a grant for £50,000. The question here then becomes, if you're still, say, receiving tax credits for all of the other R&D expenditures outside of that grant-funded project, the question here becomes, does an increase in the tax credit rate only affect those tax credit funded projects, or does it also affect your grant funded project? So you might imagine that if there are some type of technical complementarities between the different projects, that there could be some type of positive impact on the marginal effect of your grant funding. If, say, the extra subsidy money from the tax credit allowed you to buy some new machinery or to improve your lab, and therefore with those technical complementarities, all of your R&D expenditures increase, or all of your projects become more efficient. On the other hand, it could be that these funding sources are just entirely interchangeable, and in that case, then they are substitutes. So the challenge here empirically, so this is going to be a reduced form empirical paper, is that we have two endogenous policies interacting, right? So usually, just with single endogenous policy, trying to get to a causal effect is difficult, but what we're really going to be concerned with here is trying to get to kind of the causal effect of the interaction of these two subsidy types, or these two interventions. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use two different quasi-experimental research designs to study these interaction effects for both small and large firms. So getting to the heterogeneous effect of this interaction, because you might imagine that, depending on the firm size, they might respond differently to these types of R&D cost shocks. And I'm going to be using funding rules and policy changes in the UK that create separate sources of exogenous variation in the cost of investing in R&D in a way that those sources of variation don't overlap for the tax credit and grants. So to study the smaller firms, I'm going to be using a difference in discontinuities approach. So I'm going to be starting off with a sharp regression discontinuity design to identify the effect of grants. So I'm going to be studying all firms that are already receiving some grant from Innovate UK is going to be the program that I study. And the discontinuity that I use is going to be a line at 50 employees. So the Innovate UK program sets all grants for firms that are under 50 employees to be more generous than those that are just over 50 employees. So there's always going to be a 10 percentage point difference in kind of the grant rate for firms that are just under 50 employees. And I'll hopefully show you some evidence that's convincing to show you that there's no bunching or other types of policies at that 50 employee mark in the UK. And then to get to the interaction effect, I'm going to be looking at how the tax credit rate then changes over time and how that change affects the grant effect. So this is going to be the difference in discontinuity to get to the interaction effect. And for these smaller firms, I'm going to find that grants and tax credits are complements, that the increase in this tax credit rate enhances the grant effect, and it's going to be economically large. So average R&D expenditures are going to more than double. So this is a kind of large positive interaction effect. And you might be thinking that, well, is it the interaction of the subsidies, or is it just that receiving more funding in general, so kind of increasing your total amount of subsidy funding is leading to increasing returns in those subsidy dollars or subsidy pounds? And I'm going to try to show you some evidence that it does not appear to be the case that it's increasing returns to total subsidies, but that this positive interaction is in fact due to the interaction of the two mechanisms. And then to try to explain the results, I think that the story that I find most convincing here is around kind of binding financial constraints and indivisibilities. So investing in R&D requires, either buying a big new piece of new machinery or renting a lab space for a year or something along those lines. These are large indivisible expenses. These smaller firms could be financially constrained, and so receiving this extra subsidy, the extra tax credit amount, is really allowing these firms to kind of be pushed over that threshold. And I'm going to try to rule out some potential alternative explanations around input relabeling, learning, and absorptive capacity. For the larger firms, so since I used that size threshold, the firm size threshold around 50 employees to identify this interaction for the grants, for the smaller firms rather, I'm going to have to use a different method to take a look at larger firms. And here I'm going to be using a different regression discontinuity design plus some OLS stuff. So essentially I'm going to use a sharp regression discontinuity design for the tax credit effect. So this is going to be similar to the approach taken by Descriptive and others that take a look at the UK tax credit to identify just the tax credit effect on its own. And then to get to the interaction, I'm going to estimate the effect of grant funding or grant subsidy pounds on R&D expenditures separately on each side of that tax credit threshold in a kind of tight window, just in like as you would for a regression discontinuity design, but estimating the effect of grants on each side of that tax credit threshold. And I'm going to test the difference of that marginal grant effect around the tax credit rate threshold. And sorry, I should have specified the threshold that I'm using to identify this tax credit effect is for firms that are under 500 employees in the UK. These firms receive more generous tax credits than those that are just over 500 employees. And there are a few other thresholds that are involved around total assets and turnover, but we just use the one threshold given the data that we have. And so in this case, I'm going to find the results are actually completely flipped for these larger firms. So that grants and tax credits are actually substitutes. And by that, I mean the positive effect of grants is actually cut in half for firms that are receiving higher tax credits as well. And the mechanism or the explanation that I have in mind here for how this might occur is around the subsidization of inframarginal expenditures. So these would be, expenditures that the firm would have already been making even without the additional subsidy money is now being subsidized. And the idea here is that if we just have a firm that, say, has planned out their R&D expenditures for the year, and they know that they're receiving some portion of that expenditure is going to be subsidized by the grant and some portion is going to be subsidized by a tax credit, and then they have their own expenditures. The situation I have in mind here is that if you just all of a sudden increase that tax credit rate, then all of a sudden the proportion of total R&D expenditures that's being subsidized increases. And with kind of diminishing returns to each subsidy type, we're going to find a kind of a decrease in the marginal rate, the marginal effect of both grants and tax credits. And I'll try to rule out some other explanations here as well. So in terms of where this paper kind of fits into the literature, so there's been an increase in kind of quasi-experimental studies of R&D subsidies on both the grants and tax credit side separately. And so what I'm going to do is try to bring these two literatures together and say, well, actually, these two don't usually just kind of exist on their own. There's usually some type of policy mix or the layering of different subsidies. And what does that mean for thinking about the marginal effect of each one if they do in fact interact? And then of course, thinking about just taxes and innovation is kind of fits into some larger kind of public finance literatures and optimal R&D policy literatures. And especially, so I think, getting to this kind of well-identified evidence of policy interactions, I think it's rare and I think important in many different spaces. So you can imagine that like in health and labor and energy and environment, which is another space that I work in quite a bit, it's often the case that we have many different policies kind of layered on top of each other, but really trying to disentangle the effects of each one or understanding how they interact is empirically difficult. And kind of lastly, this is just an important policy question, thinking about how to finance innovation as kind of a driver of growth. So this is one space where, at least a couple of years ago, President Trump was increasing spending. It's definitely been a focus of, or was a focus of Theresa May's with increasing funding to scientific research. And of course, now kind of thinking about how we get through COVID-19 and other just kind of world issues, innovation is definitely kind of a core approach that is being considered. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of separately go through the details of the small firm and the larger firm analysis, which are each going to include kind of different data sets as well as these different methods as well that I've explained. So to study smaller firms here, I'm going to be taking a look at Innovate UK, which is a grant program in the UK. It's kind of the primary non-departmental public body that's providing grants to private companies through competitions. And so these grants, it's usually multiple rounds of different competitions for different either focus areas or just like broadly about either collaborating or things along those lines, or firms bid in for these grants. And I'm going to be studying just all firms that do receive the grants. So I don't have the right identification or kind of variation to study the extensive margin here. Everything's going to be on the intensive margin. And so these are all firms that are going to be receiving grants already. And those that are under 50 employees, or those that are considered small firms here, receive more generous grants than those that are just above 50 employees. And so by that, I mean in terms of the percentage points or the share or the rate of their total proposed grant project, that rate is going to be higher for firms that are just under 50 employees. And it's going to be that 50 employee threshold that I then use to identify the effect of this extra grant funding for those firms. And then I'm going to, so that grants kind of small firm threshold is going to be used in kind of a standard regression discontinuity design. And then what I'm going to do is see how that difference, how that discontinuity changes with an increase in the R&D tax credit. So the tax credit in the UK is quite generous. This is just kind of standard tax relief. It reduces the corporate liabilities based on a firm's R&D expenditures and some enhanced rate of those expenditures. And it translates into about, so it all kind of depends on where you fit into the scheme, but about 33% for the majority of these small firms, kind of in pre-2012 years here. And then in post-2012, and then with some incremental increases as well, the tax credit rate increased to 43%. So about this 10 percentage point increase in 2012. So what I'm going to do is see how that grant effect, or how that discontinuity at 50 employees for the grant effect changes with this increase in the tax credit rate to try to get to the interaction. So I pulled together a number of different data sets in order to do this. So the kind of key starting points are the Innovate UK Transparency Database. So this is just free online. It provides all of the information on all grant recipients. So the grant amount, competition title and year, and project cost, things of that nature. But really kind of what's important here is just having a unique company registration number that allows us to easily link this to other databases. So link this to Bureau van Dijk's FAME database, which provides all the balance sheet data. So this is going to be all information on things like R&D expenditures, which will, of course, will be the key outcome variable here, as well as the information that we need for the running variable, so employment. And it's really quite a good match. So I won't get into these details today, but I'm actually in the process of kind of updating a lot of this data with another few years of data. And the match rate is just even higher. So it's a pretty good match to the FAME database. And then I match all of this as well to the UK's business enterprise R&D kind of survey data and community innovation surveys to try to get to just a little bit more information about the types of innovations that these firms are making. And so you'll see that the sample starts out looking pretty good. I have about 12,000 grant awards for about 8,000 unique firms. And even with that really nice grant kind of match rate, what you'll see in the next slide is that actually the sample ultimately gets pretty small once I limit the sample to a narrow window around the threshold that we're interested in for the discontinuity design. So that's natural, but then also because not all firms report R&D expenditures. So I did a lot of checks to make sure that the selection or the reporting kind of didn't change in a way that I think is biasing the results. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but just to say that it really kind of takes starting with a lot of really good data to get down to a point where you have kind of a reasonable sample size to study these types of questions. But still good enough to find lots of kind of robust results. So these are just kind of the descriptive statistics of the sample that I start with for studying these smaller firms, where in the first column, you'll see this is narrowing the sample down to all firms that are under 100 employees. And then in the center, it's firms that are from 10 to 90 employees. And then on the right-hand side, it's the narrowest window that I use here, narrowing down to 20 to 80 employees. And so in panel A, this is just kind of describing how many then unique grants and firms are in those samples, still quite large, up to about 1,200 unique grants or observations in the wide window. And the project cost funded is about what we would expect given the grant rates that are kind of defined by the Innovate UK program. And then what you'll see in panel B is how that number of observations really drops once I look at how many of these firms are actually reporting their R&D expenditures, where we're down to fewer than 200 observations and even in the wide window. So this turns out to not really be a problem. And again, I'm matching this to a bunch of, or updating this with a few more years of data that I'm hoping will increase the sample size a bit as well. But really kind of the main issue that I would be concerned with from a selection perspective here, I think, is that as long as kind of that reporting appears to be similar around that 50 employee threshold, and as long as any changes in reporting over time are similar around that threshold, then this shouldn't be a problem. And that I can see in the data where it looks like almost exactly precisely the percentage of coverage around the threshold is about the same. But again, still playing with some things or updating a bunch of data and getting a few more years of data to see if we can just increase the sample size a bit here as well. So in terms of just what the method looks like in equations, we start off with a sharp regression discontinuity design to estimate the average effect of just the higher grant rates on R&D expenditures. So this here is just going to be, a dummy JI for whether the firm is under that 50 employee threshold. So whether they're considered to be a small firm and therefore receiving more generous grants. And your typical kind of allowing the running variable to vary on each side of that threshold. And the difference here now with from your typical regression discontinuity design to try to then take a look at this interaction effect is just introducing this time element of a before and after element that's interactive with the regression discontinuity design to get to this difference in discontinuity. And this is where I'm essentially just taking that regression discontinuity design and interacting it with time t, which is just an indicator for the tax credit rate increase. So this is just kind of a pre-post 2012 with the main tax credit rate increase that happened at that time. And from an identification perspective here, for the grant effect, identifying the grant effect, the key assumptions here are just what you would normally expect for a regression discontinuity, and that is that we want no running variable manipulation, so no manipulation of firm size around that 50 employee threshold, and no confounding policies that would create different benefits for firms that are under 50 employees. Turns out that that's not the case. That these assumptions do hold for the UK, and so I'll show you some evidence for that. And then for identifying the interaction effect here, normally when we think about just kind of before-after variation for a policy change, we would be concerned with having no other policies changing in that year. But here it's actually just a little bit slightly different in the sense that we want no other policies changing in 2012 that would differentially affect firms just below and above the grant threshold. So instead of worrying just about any other policy that could change in 2012, of course, many things might change in 2012. But as long as no other policies change that would differentially affect firms around that 50 employee threshold, then this interaction effect should be identified. So of course I described how we want to make sure that there's no running variable manipulation. So if we did see some type of bunching of firms just under 50 employees, for instance, we might think that these firms, because they're being strategic, that they're systematically different than firms that are just over 50 employees, and that this threshold wouldn't be considered exogenous. It doesn't appear to be the case. When we look at the density of firms, it's reasonably smooth. There's if the formal McCrary density test shows no kind of statistical log difference there. And doing a number of other empirical tests, looking at kind of covariate balances and also just running the RDD and the different disk model with covariates as the outcome variables, find no statistically significant differences there. So it appears as though firms that are kind of around that 50 employee threshold are reasonably similar on all of these observables at least. And that they're even though there are other countries such as France that have a lot of labor laws and such that kind of bind at 50 employees, as far as I understand, and given a lot of just kind of manual checking beyond this empirical evidence, that doesn't appear to be the case for the UK. A lot of the benefits that are given to kind of smaller-ish firms in the UK tend to bind at 250 employees, so kind of at that SME, small and medium-sized enterprise threshold instead. So it appears as though this kind of the main identifying assumption for the regression discontinuity piece here does hold. And so before I get into the interaction, I just want to show you what kind of the average effect of grants would look like, or of this additional grant funding would look like before we take into account the timing component. And this is where we do start to see, so essentially we would expect, if we're just looking at the grant on its own, we would expect to find kind of a jump or this change in the slope of how R&D expenditures are responding to employment, with that discontinuity being at the 50 employee threshold, where firms that are under 50 employees are receiving more generous grants than those that are over 50 employees. And we see this kind of slight change in the slope. Nothing here is really significant though. And I should say, obviously, like, I don't know if it's clear, each point here is not representing a firm, it's a group of firms and their average R&D expenditures. And then things start to look quite different once we take a look, once we break this into before and after the tax credit rate increase, which is basically just trying to visualize what this grant and tax credit rate interaction would look like. So on the left-hand side, you'll see what that grant discontinuity looks like before the tax credit rate increase, and then after the tax credit rate increase on the right. And this is where we see there's almost kind of no action before the tax credit rate increase. There seems to be just a decent amount of noise, and not really a very clear relationship between employment and R&D expenditures, but this looks very different after that tax credit rate increase. So after they're getting more generous tax credits, there seems to be this very positive, large effect of grant funding. And this is exactly what then the regression results confirm, with a bunch of other controls and such included in here as well, where we do find this kind of very large positive and statistically significant difference in discontinuity. So this top pink area would be kind of that 50 employee threshold, the grant effect, and then comparing before that grant effect before and after the tax credit rate increase, where we can see here that these average, like this effect is kind of more than double than the average expenditures, R&D expenditures for firms in this sample. So just kind of a very large and consistent and pretty stable result. And this is even when you get down to these like very small sample sizes, where we might expect to not have much statistical power here, but we do still find this result. And it's quite robust to a lot of different kind of falsification tests and robustness checks. So I take a look at kind of running the same type of model, but on pseudo-thresholds. So like using 30 employees or 70 employees or many others, where we wouldn't expect to find any type of interaction effect, because this type of threshold there's no threshold in the policy to define different grant rates at these employment levels. And so here we find, nothing. If anything, they're kind of going in the other direction. They're slightly negative. One might argue, are these just kind of noisy zeros? I mean, the fact that they're all pretty much either small or much, much smaller than the positive effects and also negative, I think that like the results are quite robust, and I'm finding this now with updated data as well. But also the main results kind of survive many other different robustness checks, looking at, say, the timing of the tax credit year, lots of different things on the polynomial flexibility in the regression discontinuity, and different winsorization rules and things like that. The results more or less don't change. And so again, we might be thinking like, well, is it that it's the interaction of these two that really matters, or is it just that more funding matters? And so I think that if the results that we're finding are just due to the increasing returns of, say, total subsidies, rather than the interaction, then I think we might expect to find that if we were to plot kind of the firm's total R&D expenditures on the y-axis relative to their total subsidies on the x-axis, we would expect that relationship to be convex. So we'd expect it to exhibit some type of increasing returns. And so what I did was I took the grant funding that we observed in the data for Innovate UK, and then calculate kind of an implied tax credit rate, tax credit based on, sorry, is there a clarifying question? No, okay. So I plot basically total R&D expenditures relative to total subsidies to see if there's some type of convexity in that relationship. And doing that in many different ways, different binning options, different winsorization rules, and really find no evidence of convexity in this relationship. So kind of the slope, like this is taking on a slightly concave shape, if anything, otherwise looks quite linear. And so I take this, at least for now, as there being kind of no evidence of increasing returns to total subsidies, but in fact that the positive interaction effect that I find is really due to the interaction of the two subsidies rather than kind of total subsidies. So the kind of takeaway from the small firm analysis is that these two, the tax credits and grants, appear to be complement. So the increase in the tax credit rate is increasing the marginal effect of grants on R&D expenditures. And so now I will also kind of separately go into the method and data for the larger firm analysis. So for the larger firms, I'm going to be like, when I say larger firms, I'm really talking about firms that are anywhere between like 250 and 750 employees-ish. So they're still considered, you know, SMEs actually, or small and medium-sized enterprises for tax credit purposes, but they're larger than the small firms that I study in the first case. So here I'm going to be using this 500 employee threshold that defines whether a firm is receiving or eligible to receive a much more generous tax credit than those that are just over that 500 employees. So this is a rate that's kind of our threshold that's been in place since 2008. So I'm just going to be looking at years from 2008 forward for now. I am also trying to see if I can update this to look at kind of a before and after 2008 plus that threshold change. But without being able to fly back to the UK right now, doing this is a little bit of a challenge. But so for now, I'm looking at just this 500 employee threshold to identify the tax credit rate impact in years after 2008. And so you can see here that firms under 500 employees receive more generous tax credits. And to get to the interaction effect here, which is kind of what the contribution that I'm trying to make with this piece, since the tax credit's been studied in previous work, is to really try to understand how this interacts with the grants. And I'm going to be doing this by estimating. I observed the total amount of like subsidy funding that these firms are receiving in total. And I estimate that effect just via OLS on the firm's R&D expenditures. But I do it separately, or allowing that to do it separately on each side of that tax credit threshold and in kind of that narrow window of, as you would for regression discontinuity, but estimating those OLS regressions on each side of it. And then testing how that OLS estimate differs at the tax credit threshold. So I also do some, I mean, you're probably thinking, oh, of course, this grant funding or subsidy funding is endogenous. You need IV if you want to get to any type of, you know, reasonable estimate for the grant funding. Very true. In the paper, I do, you know, a number of different IV things, or try to. Hard to convince people of good IVs, and also just hard to find good IVs in this type of setting. And so, if anything, you know, I'm not really convinced by the IV estimates. It's kind of moving things in the wrong direction. But what I think is useful about that exercise is showing that actually it does appear like what I need for identification here for the interaction effect is that that endogeneity of grant funding is kind of going in the same direction and is like of a similar magnitude on each side of the tax credit threshold, in order to then say, well, if we're not concerned about the grant effect, identifying the grant effect, but really about that difference in the grant effect at the tax credit threshold, as long as the endogeneity is similar around the tax credit threshold, then it shouldn't matter for identifying the interaction effect. So what I find in the IV exercise is just that it's moving those OLS estimates in a similar magnitude and direction, which kind of confirms that the endogeneity, at least as insofar as this IV is picking up some of that, moving it in a similar direction and magnitude. So the data I use for this exercise is going to be different just because of a smaller sample size for these larger firms in the Innovate UK database. They just don't have enough data for these larger firms. So I'm going to be using the business enterprise research and development data that's held by the UK Office of National Statistics. And I'm going to be using primarily their R&D investment data, of course, as the outcome variable. And then for the proxy for direct subsidies is going to be the amount of those R&D expenditures that the firm indicates was funded by the government. So I'll take that as kind of a direct subsidy or a direct grant to estimate the effect of that on each side of that tax credit threshold. And just to say the results, so I do try to corroborate the small firm results with these data. There are many reasons for why I don't use the same data for both exercises that I can talk about offline. But the general direction and magnitudes of the results are actually very similar. There's a bit noisier for this data when I take a look at the small firms. So the key identifying assumption For this larger firm analysis is just, again, to make sure that there's no bunching of firms or firm size manipulation just under now the 500 employees, which is the discontinuity that I use primarily for identifying the tax credit effect and then the difference in the grant effect. And again, it appears as though this is smooth. So there's no kind of bunching of firms right around this 500 employee threshold. There's no statistically significant difference in the McCrary density test. And again, kind of other covariate balance tests show that these firms appear to be very similar in a tight window around 500 employees. Getting close to 40 minutes, and so I'll be able to wrap up here in a few minutes here and then get to questions. So before getting to the interaction effect for these larger firms, I just want to show you what it appears as though the tax credit policy effect would be on its own. So if we were just to plot kind of firm average R&D expenditures as groups of firms again, and just to take a look at the raw data here, it appears as though there is this kind of large jump in R&D expenditures right at this 500 employee threshold, which again is where they're receiving much more generous tax credits. So this here implies, and again, the regression results confirm that this is kind of a large positive effect of the tax credit policy on its own. And if we try to convert this into some type of subsidy elasticity, it's very similar a very similar effect or very similar elasticity found relative to the Deschez-Lepet NL paper, where they're using different data and a different running variable here as well. So it's just kind of provides some confidence in this data and the slightly different approach to studying the question here. The key takeaway is just that this here confirms what was found in the literature already, that there is this positive effect of the tax credit policy when looking at it just on its own. And now what I'm going to try to do is take a look at how the grant effect then changes around that tax credit threshold. So yeah, I'm going to be estimating the impact of grants. So this is just kind of grant funding in British pounds for the firm, and estimating that impact on the firm's R&D expenditures, kind of conditional on a number of other controls and fixed effects and things of that nature. And again, as long as we're primarily focused on that difference in the grant effect at the tax credit threshold, I'm not too concerned about the endogeneity of grant funding, as long as that endogeneity is similar and moving in a similar magnitude and direction around 500 employees. And so this next table showing you the main results is going to be pretty busy with a lot of numbers, so I'll try to talk through it. So this presents kind of the main results for the interaction effect for these larger firms. So if we were just to focus on columns 3 and 4 here in pink, this is what I'm calling the mid-range window. So this is a sample that's including just firms that are between 250 and 750 employees. So it's kind of tightly around the tax credit rate threshold. And then estimating separately in columns 3 and 4 the effect of grant funding or direct subsidies on the outcome if you're below that threshold, below 500 employees, relative to over that threshold, 500 employees. And what you find here is that the effect of grant funding is positive and large and significant across all cases. This is again, these estimates are definitely endogenous. You'd need like a good IV in order to deal with this endogeneity. But again, if that endogeneity is similar at 500 employees in a tight window around that threshold, then it's really what we're concerned about is the difference. And so the difference here is that the positive effect of grants is cut in half if you're under that tax credit threshold. So and this is pretty consistent, or this is like actually the conservative case of what that difference in that kind of positive effect of the grants is at the tax credit threshold. So kind of across the board showing that at the very least, this positive effect of grants is really kind of significantly dampened with getting a more generous tax credit as well. And the IV results are consistent with this as well. So again, a number of different kind of robustness checks just to show that everything holds, kind of defining treatment slightly differently using just its own, the same year versus like whether it was 500 employees from like that, a lagged year or 2 lagged years, and a few other. I will take 30 more seconds or maybe 1 more minute and then I'll be ready. So I do a few different kind of pseudo-threshold falsification tests to make sure that the results here don't find any type of difference in other thresholds where we wouldn't expect them to be, and different polynomial kind of sensitivity checks. I can very briefly get into the mechanisms or get into it with questions, but essentially the leading explanation here for the complementarities for small firms is around kind of sizable fixed costs and financial constraints. And you can show this by taking a look at the impact of these interactions on these kind of large indivisible types of investments. So things like advanced machinery and land and buildings, and this seems to be where a lot of that positive effect is really driven from. A few different alternative explanations that can be ruled out. And then for substitution by larger firms, the idea I have in mind here is just that with kind of a larger proportion of total spending being subsidized by total subsidies that are interchangeable, you might, with diminishing returns, you'll find kind of a dampened effect of each subsidy type. So provide some evidence in the paper that goes through that, and I will wrap up and get to questions. So just to say, kind of the main takeaway here is that these mechanisms or interventions seem to be complements for small firms, substitutes for larger firms, and lots of kind of other questions that can be asked beyond this that are in this space. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to you to moderate questions or comments.
Jacqueline, many thanks for this great presentation. So if you have questions, please use raise your hand option. Then I will basically unmute your mic and you can directly ask your question to Jacqueline.
So the question was, is non-reporting of R&D expenditures creating a selection bias? And this is where, so I think, like, I was definitely concerned with this as well. And I think like the checks around, or what I was trying to do to check whether this might be a problem is to see if that non-reporting is different around the thresholds that I use for identification. So as long as the non-reporting is of a similar kind of similar rate around that 50 employee threshold, which is where it was the problem or the question, then as long as that non-reporting rate is about the same and it doesn't change differentially over time, then I think that it's not a problem for identification, but certainly would welcome further kind of questions or thoughts on that as well if you have any.
So there's another question which says, could you talk a little bit more about how you match the FAME data with the data on grants? Were you able to use the identifier, or did you have to do something else?
Sure. So the FAME data, which other piece? Because it's matched to like 10 different data sets. So was it
with the data on grants?
Okay. Yeah. So the Innovate UK data base has a company registration number, which is the UK's CRN. That's in the Innovate UK database. And so actually, this was the easiest part of the matching for the entire paper, is matching that to FAME, because then FAME has their company registration numbers as well. So it's called a national ID. It's not, I mean, I wouldn't say it's easy. But it's one of the easier bits, just because like if you have the name that's in the Innovate UK database is like similar enough. If you're familiar with using FAME and Bureau van Dijk, you can run batch searches in there now, which is kind of a new feature in the last couple of years, I think. So you can basically upload a spreadsheet with all of your company registration numbers and names and run a matching search, and it's quite easy. So yeah, the information's there.
Okay. Shahid Bello has a question. Do you consider a scenario when large firms have connection with small firms?
When they have a connection with the small firms?
Yeah. Yeah. Large firms have connection with small firms.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think, so for determining kind of where this really matters a lot is with determining the firm's size in terms of what they might be then eligible for. So certainly it's important to pay attention to, it's if a small company is owned by or if there's like a franchise or subsidiary that's owned by a larger company, it's the larger company, the ownership company that determines kind of it's their size and assets that then would determine which type of grant rate or tax credit rate that they're eligible for. So that's something that you can observe in the FAME data and need to be careful to pay attention to when looking at eligibility. But there's also this question around, do like kind of collaborations with either different size firms or different types of institutions. What does that mean for a firm's kind of R&D expenditures and their innovative activities and things of that nature? So the only thing I observe in the data on this would be, the Innovate UK grants are sometimes called collaborative grants. And so you can see if that project specifically is meant to be a collaboration and who they're collaborating with. But we wouldn't observe necessarily, so you don't observe, they're not going to be claiming tax credits together, for instance, right? But the grant itself is usually separated by who's actually, if you're the main kind of person or not. But I would say just more broadly, a very interesting kind of question that I think somebody should take a look at more closely, and there's been some work in the space, is just on the role of collaborations and different types of collaborations on innovation outcomes.
Okay, thank you. Gianmaria has a question. Gianmaria, I will just unmute your mic. You can directly ask your question.
Curious about to hear a bit more about the mechanism, because I mean there is really no theory for this research question. As far as I know, I mean, all the work that Ufuk does is on just a generic R&D subsidy. My work with him is on tax credit. I've done some other work on tax credit. From the theory point of view, it's quite an original question. And I kind of not understood the type of mechanism that she has in mind. I would like to hear a bit more. For example, I was not expecting increasing returns in R&D. So in all the structural estimation of R&D technology is convex. There are increases in terms of R&D. If you want to get any steady state, you need to get some decrease in returns. And in the data that we find. But anyway, I wanted to know a little bit more about the mechanism she has, you have in mind for you listening to me. And how how you have tested them.
Yeah, so so the mechanism, so I totally agree that the theory isn't there or developed in the literature, and certainly not in this paper. It's actually something that I'm working on a little bit right now through some revisions. Is trying to just have a basic kind of clear theory model that can explain a little bit of what I think is going on. But the mechanism that I really have in mind, especially for that kind of increasing returns situation in the smaller firms, is around binding financial constraints. And so just kind of, at least with the empirical evidence, thinking about how the empirical evidence and then combined with like an anecdotal story of what I might have in mind here, is that, these R&D projects can be, or R&D innovation pursuits can be kind of entail large indivisible expenditures, like building an entirely new lab or buying a new piece of equipment. And so these like with binding financial constraints, a small firm might have a hard time doing something like that, and that it does take kind of the boost of both of these types of subsidies in order to make that happen. But I think, and so I can test that a little bit in the data. So, just in terms of, I can go back to this. It's, so it's, I would like to kind of tie this much more tightly to the theory as well. But just to something that's kind of consistent with that anecdote is just taking a look at that interaction effect specifically on outcomes such as investments in advanced machinery or land and buildings, or these kind of large indivisible things. And this is where a lot of the effects seem to be. But totally agree. So you need to really tie this a little bit more tightly to some theory, and that's in the works right now.
Ralph Dehaas has a question. Ralph, go ahead, please.
Hello, hi. I was just wondering whether you have plans to also look at sort of R&D outcomes, more like patterns and the quality of patterns. Is that something that you have, on the agenda? Yeah,
definitely. So that's in the works, in the process of kind of gathering and matching the patent data as we speak. It's not in this paper yet for a few different reasons, but I think if at the least it kind of helps get around some R&D relabeling questions that might be useful here. I also could look at things like total factor productivity, but in general, I think looking at patents, patent quality, as well as Ralph, you would know, a big part of my research agenda is kind of around energy and environmental innovation. So I'd really like to also take a look at either how these subsidies themselves as well as their interactions affect the direction of innovation. So towards more green or dirty energy innovation, things like that. So yes, all in the works, undecided whether it belongs in this paper or another paper yet, but it is happening, and a few different kind of methods underway for doing so as well.
Great, thanks.
Lothar has a question, and the question goes as, why do some cities, high tax zones, move away from giving direct grants, but only offer tax credits?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
So why do some cities, high tax zones, move away from giving direct grants, but only offer tax credits?
Why do some, I think I'm like, everything's kind of breaking up in my my speaker at the moment, but so was the question just why do some places just offer tax credits versus
correct?
Yeah, just make sure I got that. Okay.
Why?
Yeah. So I I don't know. So I think like when we think about the purpose of any type of R&D subsidy or a grant versus a tax credit, one might think that they do kind of serve different purposes, and that things like direct grants are trying to, with providing that type of upfront subsidy is going to be slightly different than what it means. It's possibly targeting different types of innovation, different types of expenditures, different types of firms. And, depending on either a government's objectives, then you're going to get kind of a different set of policy mechanisms. But it is the case that, in a lot of the developed countries, or at least US, UK, and a lot of Europe, there are these kind of direct grant schemes and mechanisms, along with these tax credits that are kind of layered on top of those. So it's a kind of a common policy mix.
Gianmario, do you have another comment or question?
Although I understood the answer. The only comment I can have on that is that at the end it's not really clear whether that sort of complementarity is something. Okay, you have a fixed cost. Then if you add the subsidy to another subsidy, you're going to find some sort of complementarity. But that doesn't say anything about the nature of subsidies. You see what I mean? It is a difficult problem, and it boils down to understand a bit better, what is the effect of a grant, what is the channels through which it operates, and the channel through which a tax credit operates. You see, so you could do the same thing with more tax credit. If it's about a fixed cost, so the more credit I give you, the higher is going to be the bang for the buck. So you remain this mystery, and I don't have an answer. I'm also thinking about these questions from a more structural point of view. But yeah, so this is my last comment.
Yeah, it's a really good point and comment and response. Yeah, I think this paper and this research definitely cannot kind of speak to some of the like optimal policy questions per se, and saying, well, do we need more of one versus the other? But I think what it can kind of speak to is more along the lines of the heterogeneity and whether we need. So if we take a look at, if you find that two interventions or mechanisms are complements, for these smaller firms, if we believe those results, then kind of the answer is that we need both for those types of firms if the goal is to increase R&D expenditures. Whereas for the larger firms where they are substitutes, you only need one of them. So there's definitely a limit on what we can say about policy, kind of optimal policy design here, and it does take knowing a lot more about the mechanisms through which each of these is occurring and what the objectives are. But what we can kind of say is that for these larger firms, having both is inefficient.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to end here. Jacqueline, thank you very much for your presentation, and we wish you all the good luck with the paper, and see you everyone next week, next Tuesday at 3 p.m. London time again. Have a good day.
Great. Thank you again. Thanks everybody.